Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuing story of the Browns at Christmas. The Browns leaving Paris and heading for London for Christmas Eve. Last words were, "At what a sight he would behold. She could see it all, to the last widespread daub. But she could not see, she could not tell herself what in such a position a man would do. At any rate, not what that man would do. Her husband, she thought, would tell his wife, and then the two of them between them would put up with it. There are misfortunes which, if they be published, are simply aggravated by ridicule. But she remembered the features of the man, the stranger, as she had seen them at that instant in which she had dropped his beard. And she thought that there was a ferocity in them, a certain tenacity of self-importance, which would not permit their owner to endure such treatment in silence. Would he not storm and rage and ring the bell and call all Paris to witness his revenge? But the storming and the raging had not reached her yet, and now it wanted but 5:15. In 3/4 of an hour they would be in that demi-omnibus which they had ordered for themselves, and in half an hour after that they would be flying towards Thompson Hall. Then she allowed herself to think of those coming comforts, of those comforts so sweet, if only they would come. That very day now present to her was the 24th December. And on that very evening she would be sitting in Christmas joy among all her uncles and cousins, holding her new brother-in-law affectionately by the hand. Oh, what a change from pandemonium to paradise, from that wretched room, from that miserable house in which there was such ample cause for fear, to all the domestic Christmas bliss of the home of the Thompsons. She resolved that she would not at any rate be deterred by any light opposition on the part of her husband. "It wants just 5:15, she said, putting her hand steadily upon his shoulder, "and I'll get a cup of chocolate for you so that you may get up comfortably." "I've been thinking about it," he said, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hands. "It will be so much better to go over by the mail train tonight. We should be in time for Christmas just the same." "That will not do at all," she answered energetically. "Come, Charles, after all the trouble, do not disappoint me." "It is such a horrid grind. Think what I have gone through, what I have done for you. In 12 hours we shall be there among them all. You won't be so little like a man as not to go on now." He threw himself back upon the bed and tried to readjust the clothes around his neck. "No, Charles, no," she continued. "Not if I know it. Take your chocolate and get up. There is not a moment to be lost." With that she laid her hand upon his shoulder and made him clearly understand that he would not be allowed to take further rest in that bed. Grumbling, sulky, coughing continually, and declaring that life under such circumstances was not worth having, he did at last get up and dress himself. When once she knew that he was obeying her, she became again tender to him, and certainly took much more than her own share of the trouble of the proceedings. Long before the time was up she was ready, and the porter had been summoned to take the luggage downstairs. When the man came, she was rejoiced to see that it was not he whom she had met among the passages during her nocturnal rambles. He shouldered the box, and told them that they would find coffee and bread and butter in the small manger below. I told you that would be so, when you would boil that stuff, said the ungrateful man, who had nevertheless swallowed the hot chocolate when it was given to him. They followed their luggage down into the hall, but as she went, at every step, the lady looked around her. She dreaded the sight of that porter of the night. She feared lest some potential authority of the hotel should come to her and ask her some horrid question. But of all her fears, her greatest fear was that there should arise before her an apparition of that face which she had seen recumbent on its pillar. As they passed the door of the great salon, Mr. Brown looked in. "Why, there it is still," said he. "What?" said she, trembling in every limb. "The mustard pot." "They have put it in there since," she exclaimed, energetically in her despair. "But never mind, the omnibus is here, come away." And she absolutely took him by the arm. But at that moment, a door behind them opened, and Mrs. Brown heard herself called by her name. And there was the night porter with a handkerchief in his hand. But the further doings of that morning must be told in a further chapter. It had been visible to Mrs. Brown from the very first moment of her arrival on the ground floor that something was the matter. If we may be allowed to use such a phrase, and she felt all but convinced that this something had reference to her. She fancied that the people of the hotel were looking at her as she swallowed or tried to swallow her coffee. When her husband was paying the bill, there was something disagreeable in the eye of the man who was taking the money. Her sufferings were very great, and no one sympathized with her. Her husband was quite at his ease, except that he was complaining of the cold. When she was anxious to get him out into the carriage, he still stood there, leisurely arranging shawl after shawl around his throat. "You can do that quite as well in the omnibus," she had just said to him very crossly, when there appeared upon the scene through a side door that very night porter, whom she dreaded, with a soiled pocket handkerchief in his hand. Even before the sound of her own name met her ears, Mrs. Brown knew it all. She understood the full horror of her position from that man's hostile face and from the little article which he held in his hand. If during the watches of the night she had had money in her pocket, if she had made a friend of this greedy fellow by well-timed liberality, all might have been so different. But she reflected that she had allowed him to go on feed after all his trouble, and she knew that he was her enemy. It was the handkerchief that she feared. She thought that she might have brazened out anything but that. No one had seen her enter or leave that strange man's room. No one had seen her dip her hands in that jar. She had no doubt been found wandering about the house while the slumberer had been made to suffer so strangely, and there might have been suspicion and perhaps accusation. But she would have been ready with frequent protestation to deny all charges made against her, and though no one might have believed her, no one could have convicted her. Here, however, was evidence against which she would be unable to stand for a moment. At the very first glance, she acknowledged the potency of that damning morsel of linen. During all the horrors of the night, she had never given a thought to the handkerchief, and yet she ought to have known that the evidence it would bring against her was palpable and certain. Her name, M. Brown, was plainly written on the corner. What a fool she had been not to have thought of this. Had she but remembered the plain marking which she, as a careful, well-conducted British matron, had put upon all her clothes, she would, at any hazard, have removed the article. Oh, that she had waked the man, or bribed the porter, or even told her husband. But now she was, as it were, friendless, without support, without a word that she could say in her own defence, convicted of having committed this assault upon a strange man as he slept in his own bedroom, and then of having left him. The thing must be explained by the truth. But how to explain such truth? How to tell such story in a way to satisfy injured folk, and she with only barely time sufficient to catch the train? Then it occurred to her that they could have no legal right to stop her because the pocket handkerchief had been found in a strange gentleman's bedroom. "Yes, it is mine," she said, turning to her husband, as a porter with a loud voice asked if she were not Madame Brown. "Take it, Charles, and come on." Mr. Brown naturally stood still in astonishment. He did not put out his hand, but the porter would not allow the evidence to pass so readily out of his custody. "What does it all mean?" asked Mr. Brown. "A gentleman has been, something has been done to a gentleman in his bedroom," said the clerk. "Something done to a gentleman?" repeated Mr. Brown. "Something very bad indeed," said the porter. "Look here," and he showed the condition of the handkerchief. "Charles, we shall lose the train," said the frightened wife. "What the mischief does it all mean?" demanded the husband. "Did Madame go into the gentleman's room?" asked the clerk. Then there was an awful silence, and all eyes were fixed upon the lady. "What does it all mean?" demanded the husband. "Did you go into anybody's room?" "I did," said Mrs. Brown, with much dignity, looking round upon her enemies as a stag at bay would look upon the hounds which are attacking him. "Give me the handkerchief." But the night porter quickly put it behind his back. "Charles, we cannot allow ourselves to be delayed. You shall write a letter to the keeper of the hotel explaining it all." Then she essayed to swim out through the front door into the courtyard in which the vehicle was waiting for them. But 3 or 4 men and women interposed themselves, and even her husband did not seem quite ready to continue his journey. "Tonight is Christmas Eve," said Mrs. Brown, "and we shall not be at Thompson Hall. Think of my sister." "Why did you go into the man's bedroom, my dear?" whispered Mr. Brown in English. But the porter heard the whisper and understood the language. The porter, who had not been tipped. "Yes," asked the porter. "It was a mistake, Charles. There is not a moment to lose. I can explain it all to you in the carriage." Then the clerk suggested that Madame had better postpone her journey a little. The gentleman upstairs had certainly been very badly treated, and had demanded to know why so great an outrage had been perpetrated. The clerk said that he did not wish to send for the police. Here Mrs. Brown gasped terribly and threw herself on her husband's shoulder. But he did not think he could allow the party to go till the gentleman upstairs had received some satisfaction. It had now become clearly impossible that the journey could be made by the early train. Even Mrs. Brown gave it up herself, and demanded of her husband that she should be taken back to her bedroom. "But what is to be said to the gentleman?" asked the porter. Of course, it was impossible that Mrs. Brown should be made to tell her story there in the presence of them all. The clerk, when he found he had succeeded in preventing her from leaving the house, was satisfied with a promise from Mr. Brown that he would inquire from his wife what were these mysterious circumstances, and would then come down to the office and give some explanation. If it were necessary, he would see the strange gentleman, whom he now ascertained to be a certain Mr. Jones, returning from the east of Europe. He learned also that this Mr. Jones had been most anxious to travel by that very morning train which he and his wife had intended to use, that Mr. Jones had been most particular in giving his orders accordingly, but that at the last moment he had declared himself to be unable even to dress himself because of the injury which had been done him during the night. When Mr. Brown heard this from the clerk just before he was allowed to take his wife upstairs, while she was sitting on a sofa in a corner with her face hidden, a look of awful gloom came over his own countenance. What could it be that his wife had done to the man of so terrible a nature? "You had better come up with me," he said to her, with marital severity. And the poor cowed woman went with him tamely as might have done some patient Gurzel. Not a word was spoken till they were in the room and the door was locked. "Now," said he, "what does it all mean?" It was not till nearly 2 hours had passed that Mr. Brown came down the stairs very slowly, turning it all over in his mind. He had now gradually heard the absolute and exact truth, and had very gradually learned to believe it. It was first necessary that he should understand that his wife had told him many fibs during the night, but, as she constantly alleged to him when he complained of her conduct in this respect, they had all been told on his behalf. Had she not struggled to get the mustard for his comfort? And when she had secured the prize, had she not hurried to put it on, as she had fondly thought, his throat? And though she had fibbed to him afterwards, had she not done so in order that he might not be troubled? "You are not angry with me because I was in that man's room?" she asked, looking full into his eyes, but not quite without a sob. He paused a moment, and then declared with something of a true husband's confidence in his tone that he was not in the least angry with her on that account. Then she kissed him, and bade him remember that, after all, no one could really injure them. "What harm has been done, Charles? The gentleman won't die because he has had a mustard plaster on his throat. The worst is about Uncle John and dear Jane. They do think so much of Christmas Eve at Thompson Hall." Mr. Brown, when he again found himself in the clerk's office, requested that his card might be taken up to Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones had sent down his own card, which was handed to Mr. Brown. "Mr. Barnaby Jones." "And how was it all, sir?" asked the clerk in a whisper which had at the same time something of authoritative demand and something also of submissive respect. The clerk, of course, was anxious to know the mystery. It is hardly too much to say that everyone in that vast hotel was by this time anxious to have the mystery unravelled. But Mr. Brown would tell nothing to anyone. "It is merely a matter to be explained between me and Mr. Jones," he said. The card was taken upstairs, and after a while he was ushered into Mr. Jones's room. It was, of course, that very 353 with which the reader is already acquainted. There was a fire burning, and the remains of Mr. Jones's breakfast were on the table. He was sitting in his dressing gown and slippers, with his shirt open in the front, and a silk handkerchief very loosely covering his throat. Mr. Brown, as he entered the room, of course, looked with considerable anxiety at the gentleman of whose conduct he had heard so sad an account. But he could only observe some considerable stiffness of movement and demeanour as Mr. Jones turned his head round to greet him. "This has been a very disagreeable accident, Mr. Jones," said the husband of the lady. "Accident? I don't know how it could have been an accident. It has been a most monstrous, I must say, interference with a gentleman's privacy and personal comfort." "Quite so, Mr. Jones. But on the part of the lady, who is my wife." "So I understand. I myself am about to become a married man, and I can understand that your feelings must be, I wish to say, as little as possible to harrow them." Here Mr. Brown bowed. "But there's a fact. She did do it. She thought it was me." "What?" "I give you my word as a gentleman, Mr. Jones. When she was putting that mess upon you, she thought it was me. She did, indeed." Join me. Join me for the next video. Join me for the next video of the Browns. The Browns at Christmas. The Browns at White Christmas. Join me for the next video. Difficult not to smile reading that. Join me for the next video of the Browns. So until then, morale say, see you then. Okay, bye.